Boom! What's up, everyone? Welcome to Simulation. I'm your host, Alan Sakyan. Very excited to be talking about digital globalization, talking about political science, talking about geopolitical business strategy, India, China. We have Dr. Matthew Rudolph joining us on the show. Hello.
Hello, Alan.
Thank you for coming on. Really
Thank you for having me.
appreciate it.
It's nice to be here.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I remember when we first met after Adam Gazelli's First Fridays last month, I was super fascinated by your geopolitical knowledge, and I was like, let's do a show together. This is going to be a lot of fun. And you have a very solid background for this as well. 10.5 years as Director of Engagement at the Lubuntu at work, and that's doing things like helping Asian and African women escape poverty. And it's very exciting stuff because we've had Maguette Wade on the show as well, who's doing very similar work with engaging women and individuals in up-and-coming economies to escape poverty. Super important work. And then also 5 years as assistant professor in the government department at Georgetown University, and now most recently at ERO projects doing the chief advisor of supply chain risk, ethics, and business strategy there.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a lot of fun. Very excited. Okay, we're going to start with our big history take. We love starting this way. So, okay, we find ourselves as stewards of Earth after a long period of evolution, and here we are. What is your current synthesis on the state of humanity?
I am moderately hopeful for a variety of reasons. Obviously, climate change and environmental degradation are the major risks. As a political scientist, you know, I have to be concerned about political disruption and war and conflict, an area that I used to study. It's not a great week for considerations of war and conflict around the world right now between the Korean Peninsula and South Asia, India, and Pakistan. But I do consider major power war and great power conflict to be on the decline. So I'd put that at a lower probability than risks from climate change. The reliance on fossil fuels, the carbon economy is finally getting the scrutiny that it needs. So I'm less concerned about that, and encouraged by the fact that a lot of people are thinking about adaptation, which I know is a controversial topic. I think it's a good thing, and it's important to start thinking about it. That doesn't mean that those are certainties. Population growth and poverty are major concerns, and combined with climate problems in areas like South Asia, this is a problem for at least those populations. If we're talking about global civilization, which is not something I typically talk about, I like to talk about civilizations like the Sinic, the Chinese civilization, the Indic civilization, European or Atlantic civilization, multiple civilizations. But if we're talking about the global civilization, I am moderately optimistic on.
Yeah. And this is, again, your lens is, this is so important to identify. It's that most of the time when we speak with other people around us in our little bubbles of community, we don't necessarily reach out into what Asian civilizations are like. What is Chinese civilization, Indian civilization actually like, African European civilization, South American civilization? Because when we, and even then, if we just go and look at one little article about something, we're only taking one perspective on the issue. We're not reading the dozens of perspectives on that issue. What is life like to be born over there? What stimuli do we absorb? And so having a fascination with that is, again, this is one of the reasons why we're here talking, because of your obsession with studying this and learning and teaching about it. Okay, so let's talk about that obsession and that journey. You know, you're a kid and you're finding out, you know, who you are, what your character role is in this big story of life. And so how did you land on political science and Asia? You had tremendous influence from your parents.
Political science as a profession ended up surprising me a little bit. The interest in Asia, particularly India and South Asia, was part of a family vector. My parents were also political scientists. They spent most of their career at the University of Chicago. And so they took me and my sisters, I have 2 older sisters, to India with them when they would go every 4 years. So growing up between the ages of 2 and 16, I spent a year every 4th year in India, sometimes in parochial Catholic schools, sometimes in a boarding school in the Indian Himalaya, and then later when I graduated, or when I was in college, I spent time there. Subsequently, my professional career in arms control took me there, and then later, as I moved into political science, formally getting a doctorate in political science, I started doing research and language training and other things there. So that's the story of it, but it started with my parents and their fascination with it, and I happened accidentally to have this with me today, which is a book called Destination India, published by Oxford University Press, that is the journal that my mother kept while she and my father drove from Calais in France all the way to Madras, what is today Chennai, in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, overland in a Land Rover, going through all the countries in between. That would be a difficult trip to take today, Alan, going through Iran, Afghanistan, at the time Yugoslavia, which was, as they drove through, mobilizing for war in 1956. So, you know, a tricky trip. They did it. They did it without a weapon. My mother always believed that it's more dangerous to have one on you than to not. And yep, they did it overland. So anyway, that's sort of part of the story. And through my parents, I learned a lot about India. Grew up with a community of people in North India known as Rajputs. These are the former nobility. And they were a group that my parents started studying early on. So spent time there, but then because of my experience in the Himalaya, looking across from the boarding school I was at the Chinese border, I started having an interest in China, and over the years got interested in Chinese and Indian art. So political science ended up being an accident for me. I was an art history major in college. I wanted to go into art history, but couldn't get work when I graduated in that field when I was in Washington, D.C. And at that time, apropos of what's happening this week, a lot of people were concerned about Indian and Pakistani nuclearization. Yeah. So I started working in the arms control space, and from there decided I'd go into a degree in political science. So my passion is that part of the world for those reasons.
Yes, let's hit a couple of the junctions that you listed on the way to on the way there. You know, first is it's so cool that your parents got the chance to drive, you know, from London after getting to France on the ferry all the way to India, and that that this is what 1956. 56.
Yeah.
In 56, this even being possible is so important, right? Because thinking about trying to do this today, like why, if the world has gotten so much better, right? The better angels of our nature, why can't we drive from France to India anymore, right? So these are these important questions to ask ourselves. And so there's that. And then also that, you know, they were so fascinated with studying and they brought you along once every 4 years to India. So you got that deep immersion into culture yourself. Right. That was very important. And your 2 sisters did too. So then you guys all had your like perspective augmented through going into another culture. You know, that in itself is already, you're seeing the world from another civilizational perspective. And so that is that's building up a stronger, in what I call a mental lattice, right? A multidisciplinary view of the world. Okay, and then here towards the end, you started indicating this. You know, many people aren't necessarily studying these conflicts that are going on across the world, and sometimes we're just thinking of like you know, Israel and Palestine, or we're thinking North and South Korea, or we're thinking what is, you know, we don't really get to sometimes Pakistan and India. Yes, and so that has been a serious serious place
Yeah.
of contention. So now tell us about, you actually went for a period of time after you did the UC Berkeley, and then you did Taiwan.
Yeah, actually, so
And then
I did
Cornell.
spend some time at UC Berkeley. My doctorate is from Cornell University.
Yeah.
My undergraduate degree is from Swarthmore College, where I did the art history. But I spent time at Cal because it is so strong. Not that Cornell is not strong in East and South Asia, but Cal is remarkable. And I did spend time learning Mandarin in Taiwan and on the mainland. That's the sort of development of the Chinese angle that came later in my life, and the interest in China, and particularly the relations between China and India, and China, India, and the U.S., the triangle of the three.
Yes, and this is again one of these images that's so profound. It's just taking and drawing a circle around China and India, and then saying there's more people that live inside of this circle than outside of this circle. That one is a very profound mind expansion, which may actually soon be changing in some ways with the African population. I learned that the statistic is their median age on the African continent is 18.
Yeah, they're very young. India is also quite young. China is getting old fast. I think we tangled on this question of the populations when we first met. And you did point out that 1.4 each about in India and China. So which I think brings us to about a third of the global population, with the other 2/3 in the rest of the world.
Bangladesh and all these other
South Asia, if you take all of South Asia and all of Greater China, then you're getting close to half the population probably. But I don't, consciousness of South Asia this week, of course, we can talk about this more, but I'm sure the Pakistanis are upset about Michael Cohen testifying in Congress, and that the president is in Vietnam trying to deal with the North Koreans. Because it brings less attention to the fact that they've been attacked by the Indians, or retaliatory attack by the Indians happened. But we are talking about two nuclear-armed countries. If we're talking about risk to civilization, the risk went up this week with the capture of an Indian airman after an attack on Monday night our time across the contested border in Kashmir. This is one of the things that people who are concerned about nuclear escalation and the risks of nuclear war put the South Asian conflict between India and Pakistan pretty high on the list, along with North Korea, as something to think about. And I just thought I would flag that as something that's happening as we speak.
Again, this is one of those contested areas, and again, this whole notion of wanting control over land, over money and greed and resources, all this type of stuff that human ethics have a bit to go for evolution-wise. I want us to just spend a little more time here behind your eyes in your life story. Take us to what you're learning as you're studying. You're there. You were talking about being there with your parents in India. Experiencing this, also studying Mandarin as well. So teach us about kind of like what you started seeing.
Well, I mean, an important part of it was spending time in the Indian Himalaya. So from where I walked to and from school, I could see the Chinese border. I could see 2 or 3 of the major points of Hindu sacred geography. And so talking about civilizational centers, these are the places where the Ganges River, originates. And so, that has a profound impact on your consciousness if you're thinking regularly about that. And that drove a lot of my interest in that part of the world, and including seeing pilgrims going to these various religious sites, walking days, elderly mothers walking, miles and miles to these pilgrimage sites, impresses upon one the power of faith. and of sacred geography. So that I think that's part of it. As I said, I spent a lot of time hanging out with the Rajputs of North India, the former nobility, this is in the state of Rajasthan that abuts Pakistan. So again, one side looking to the Chinese border, the other side, when you're in Jaisalmer, Rajasthan, this ancient fort on the Pakistani border, you can look into Pakistan. The geography itself impressed itself upon my consciousness and probably shaped my interest in that sort of nexus of China, India, Pakistan. And then, of course, the politics of India, the world's largest democracy, is fascinating. And over time, as I started to learn more about it, sort of became ever more fascinated by it. And it stands in great contrast to the world's largest and most powerful authoritarian system, the Chinese, and a very different system of politics, even though they both came out of large, poor, agrarian societies at the end of World War II. So they progressed in very different directions. And this, of course, is one of the fundamental questions of comparative political science. How do you end up with comparative political systems, democracy in India, authoritarianism in China, and the bizarre and very confounding puzzle for economists, political scientists, and sociologists that the Chinese have educated and enriched their population much more than the Indians have. Right?
Yeah.
This is a big problem for advocates or promoters of democracy, right?
Yeah,
This,
what
the
a
China-India contrast.
What a puzzle.
So the more I thought about these problems, the less I was able to escape thinking about them more. Yeah.
And so then, is that what you ended up spending a good amount of your time on, the puzzle that you were describing?
Yeah, the China-India puzzle. The problem is that eventually the question of authoritarianism versus democracy runs into a little bit of a dead end. There's, until those experiments are done, it's kind of hard to say more about them. And so you have to drop down a level and look at specific issues inside of the countries. And so, for example, my doctoral dissertation compared regulatory bodies in the two countries, specifically those regulating finance, right? How are non-banking finance regulated in China and India, particularly stocks and bonds? So that narrows the picture and looks at these looks at the comparison in a more tractable fashion. I always encourage my students to think about big questions, but to research them from a narrow focus. Over time, I think, the fields of sociology, economics, political science, anthropology will learn a lot from the current status of China and India in their different political conditions. But by looking at small questions rather than just the democracy versus authoritarianism, which gets into a somewhat repetitive cycle at some point.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It absolutely does. These conversations are happening around the world on, authoritarianism, democracy, capitalism, socialism, and it's just over and over again, just looking at kind of what seems to be like we're running simulations of how civilizations evolve, and until we know how to update the code most effectively for society, and put that to the test. This is why libertarians are kind of exciting to try these little kind of niches around the world of trying out certain protocols that have yet to be explored. These are interesting augmentations in code that I think we can explore. Okay, so this is good. Now, where did that lead you to? Kind of, how did you get involved in the Ubuntu at work from there? Yeah.
So, at some point, I do want to circle back to libertarians in the Himalaya, because there's a very interesting theory and practice of anarchism in the Asian Himalaya. Let's bracket that.
We should do that now.
Do that now. Okay.
Yeah, it's on the way.
And then I can get back to Ubuntu at work and focus on livelihoods, income generation in low-income countries in general.
Yes.
But again, circling back to the point where I told you I would walk to school every day in the Indian Himalaya and look at the high Himalaya, the populations that now occupy the space that more or less goes from the mountains of Afghanistan across the mountainous zone all the way into Southeast Asia, Burma, Laos, and Cambodia, the mountain zones there, is all one chain of mountains.
Yeah.
And there is a theory that is contested. I think it's one of those theories that, whether it's true or not, causes us to think in very interesting ways about a part of the world and about ways of being, ways people are in the world. But that area is described by a Dutch anthropologist as Zomaya, and it is occupied by what he calls anarchists. And the Yale political scientist James Scott has written a famous book called The Art of Not Being Governed.
Yes.
That is about this population and how he believes, as does his colleague, the Dutch anthropologist, that these occupants of Zomaya are escapees from organized civilizations, religion, armies, taxation, mass agriculture, and that they fled up into the mountains to get away, and they are the original anarchists. And that's an important and interesting theory. What are their practices? How do they govern themselves?
Yes. If they meditate so much that they are able to encounter another human being and not bop them over the head for their land and their etc., then you can actually slowly figure out how to work together as social primates.
Right. And it is also true that most of the ones, particularly the sort of most anarchistic ones, are nomads, right? They do not tie themselves to a specific piece of land, which is an important sort of fundamental element of this problem. Anyway, if we think about libertarianism and anarchism, it's important to put it in contrast to other issues. And James Scott has now recently come out with another book called Against the Grain, which is not about how people in the Bay Area are gluten-free. It is actually about how organized agriculture was one of the driving forces for the establishment of violent, orthodox, organized civilizations that provide the context for anybody to want to be a libertarian or anarchist. So that is, the arguments behind Against the Grain.
That having agriculture draws people in to live in these cities. You can supply more food to more people, and they can live more densely. But then it makes you a larger target for military to take the food.
Right.
Is that the thing?
That is part of the theory. Once you have surplus from agriculture, you then are a target. It also means that the state itself can begin to specialize. So you can have armies that can then attack other places, and you have more complex social organization where you need ideologies or systems of control, such as religion, caste systems, hierarchies, and you have the ability to tax surpluses. So taxation, armies, orthodoxy, ideology are all outflows of fixed agriculture.
So 10,000 years ago, we wouldn't have, even now, thinking back, most people associate the religion to, this this control systems were 2,000 years old, let's say. But this goes back 10,000 years to egg, because egg kind of domesticated us in a way. That's so interesting. And then the control systems came up in so many other ways with the cities and the laws.
And this is, this is part of the Mesopotamian, what is now Persia and Iran, and Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in northwest India. These are
that's the Indus Valley.
Yeah, Indus Valley. And likewise in the Yellow River and Pearl River zones. These three great zones of civilization genesis, all conform roughly to the Scott and other theories on these things.
It's very interesting. I'm going to have to dig deeper into that, and hopefully we can feature more of the leaders that are figuring that out in the world. Now, just another quick thought that I think you might find interesting is that when you find yourself kind of in this, like you were explaining this, you're up in version one of the anarchists of we don't subscribe to your governing.
Zomaya.
Zomaya.
It's called they call it Zomaya.
Zomaya. When you find yourself as Zomaya, it's quite also humbling to where you see the start of these really important rivers, the Ganges River and whatnot, where you're seeing this. You also don't necessarily, there's a view that I hope to share with people, is that if you barricade off that initial water supply, and then when the people come up and say, why are you barricading this off? And then you say, you have to pay me in order for me to let it roll, and here are my guns protecting me. So there's different ways to behave as civilizations evolve, so that you can play in a more cooperative game.
Well, unfortunately, the current history of the Indian Himalayan watersheds is not, despite what I said at the beginning of the program, is not all that good. So on February 14th, Indian paramilitary forces were attacked by a Pakistani-based terrorist group. The next week, the Indians threatened and are taking measures that probably will end up reneging on a deal that they have with Pakistan for the sharing of those very waters of the Indus River that we just discussed. There is a treaty that the two countries have that has more or less stood the test of time, 3 major wars, lots of points of tension up until today. And if the Indian government goes through with this, the misery of poor people in Pakistan who rely on the flows of water from that treaty agreement are going to suffer badly. And those poor people in the lowlands of Pakistan probably had very little to do with the attack on the Indian troops. Similarly, North China is experiencing a major drought, and if you want to talk about risks to, the Chinese, I beg your pardon?
Near Mongolia.
Well, area? No, like even the area of near Beijing and basically the whole northeast quadrant of China is already in technical drought, and their measures are being taken, and there's a lot of concern that it will get much worse. The Chinese have plans now to start diverting the waters that flow from the Himalaya now through the Brahmaputra and other waterways through India and into Bangladesh. And people who are pessimists about this, who are, let's say, more hawkish on this issue in India, believe that there will be a war or intense conflict between India and China around that water, and the soon demise of the Zomayans that we were just talking about, these anarchists who live in the uplands of India and China and upland Asia, are all going to suffer and are already suffering because of the militarization of the Himalaya. So railroads, roads, airfields, waterworks, all of the things of that civilization brings people
are moving into the Himalaya as part of the potential water conflict that is coming there.
Yeah. I really appreciate your lens on all of this. This is so enlightening already. Okay, let's do Ubuntu.
Okay.
Ubuntu at work. Yeah.
Well, we can talk about Ubuntu at work. It's an organization set up by its founder, Vibha Pingle. It is now currently on hold as we have some governance issues. I have taken what I learned there, which is the reason I got into Ubuntu at work was because having studied low-income countries in South Asia like India and Pakistan and China, which was once a low-income country, now a middle-income country. A lot of people even describe India as a middle-income country, but that's only because they have a lot of really rich people, along with a lot of very poor people. But I wanted to learn more about grassroots, rubber meeting road development work and what that means. I also came to understand some time ago, and now I think many more people understand it, although it's embarrassing that I didn't understand it at that time, the horrible condition of women in South Asia generally and in North India in particular. And so Ubuntu at Work was particularly focused on livelihoods and self-regard for women. Yeah. And so that is what took me into that work. And the work that I'm now doing on supply chain ethics and analysis that is more focused on Africa, where there are similar conditions of for women and for livelihood of low-income people, is what's taking me into that in the agriculture space, particularly with nuts, cashew nuts and other types of nuts. Mm-hmm. And that's all of a piece. This was, I had studied elite politics, I'd studied global conflict prevention, but I had never really looked at the grassroots level, the individual level, and the condition of women. And so that is what took me into that space.
That's very important to talk about. Right. That right. When we sat down with Maguette too, her ability to teach us about what happens when you're able to provide someone with these economic degrees of freedom, to enable them to escape poverty with having something to do every single day that they enjoy doing, that provides to them with meaning, that provides them with degrees of freedom as well, and takes them away from all the violence and potential that is such an incredibly important thing.
Right, and the positive change is not going to happen just by, global summits and treaties and all the rest of it. It will happen because the genders of all types become more equal, because economic inequality, or at least absolute poverty, is diminished. So
opportunities are provided in those areas. And then like you were saying with supply chain stuff, and Maguette was also teaching us about how there's just some egregious policies and regulations that are occurring that prevent like the import of a certain good, or they highly tax the import of a certain good, that makes it really difficult to be able to produce that final product in that area. Yeah. And these are old lines of code that need to be updated.
Right. Well, taxes or tariffs, this is a interesting issue, and optimizing them is what trade theory and economic policy is about. We're learning more than we ever. The one positive thing about the Trump era is that I don't think any American who could read during the last 3 years will ever have the same types of questions about what a tariff is that my students did a decade ago. So for good and ill, people are learning about global trade in a way they never had before, in the US at least.
And Ubuntu did about 5,000 or so female entrepreneurs.
Right. So again, we're in a bit of a hiatus or a holding point right now, but during the decade or so of the high active operation, we helped about 5,000 women with a variety of different, what are called in this area, business services. Things like helping them with inventory, helping them with entrepreneurship activities. The main, most effective channel that Vibha Pingle devised and then promoted was the use of workspaces. So this provides a safe workspace where people can come and do whatever work that they have on their own. Ubuntu then had contracts for various types of work that we could give people if they wanted additional income. And the main thing is having them on site then, even though we did not provide microfinance or did not provide financial inclusion or other things, we could put them in touch with people that would do those things, or mobile telephony or computer literacy, in many cases just basic numeracy, by partnering with other people, having women on site at the workspace allowed us to provide these services. Yes. And it is, it's sort of the story of if you have one goat and then next year you have 2 goats, that's 100% growth. For that person, that's a significant increase, right? If you 1 year don't know how to operate your mobile phone, or you don't have a safe place to check your inventory and count your money, and then in the next period you do have those things, it's a major improvement.
Yeah. Okay, so how much of what you've been teaching us from your research in India, China, and the Himalayan, and the what you're just saying about Ubuntu, how much of that synthesis were you also teaching at Georgetown, or which aspects of the 5 years when you're teaching there were you hitting?
At Georgetown, I taught sort of 3 different channels. One was conflict in Asia, which has been, an area of interest to me since I left college and started working on arms control issues, India, Pakistan, Korean Peninsula, India, China, violent conflict in Asia. So I taught courses on that. And then my other area of interest is the political economy of Asia. So I taught courses on business, government, and globalization with a focus on China and India. Basically, how have the Chinese and Indian economies globalized? More or less in the period since 1980, let's call it. And that had a large focus on finance and on models of development and the authoritarian versus democratic contrast. And then the larger question of comparative politics in general. So where do states come from, right? This question of civilizations. India and China had some of the earliest, and most people argue the establishment of something that we would call a state first happened in China with the development of a bureaucracy, an examination system, what we would consider today a organized state first emerged in China. The Indians, Mesopotamians, a bunch of others, came along with those as well. So comparative state formation, how are states formed? The question that you brought up of war and capture drives a lot of that, which eventually kind of dovetails with questions of conflict. So you can see the beginnings of emergence, overlapping. So at Georgetown, I taught these 3 things: violent conflict in Asia, political economy of Asia, and comparative politics. Almost always with a focus, sort of centrally on the China-India comparison, but with the rest of Asia and the rest of the world in view. As sort of a preview to another part of where we're going here is the civilizational element. And this, once you can't talk about China or India or Sinic or Indic activities without thinking about civilizations. When I was in graduate school was when the famous political scientist Samuel Huntington published his article, The Clash of Civilizations, wondering what will happen to the global politics after the end of the Cold War. The Cold War organized global politics for the period from 1945 to the period until 1990. What happens after that organizing principle of Cold War diminishes or shrivels. And Huntington said we will have a clash of civilizations. It was a complicated thesis. Most people disagree with it today, but it still provoked a lot of thinking, and it inspired the revival of civilizational thinking. My advisor at Cornell, a fellow named Peter Katzenstein, who has, along with Huntington and others, helped revive this interest in civilizational thinking, comparative civilizational thinking here. Not a single global civilization, but comparative civilizations based around the axial religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, began to grow. And so this question of how will civilizations comparing, competing, cooperating be a new organizing principle is a question that's out there. And
kind of the most important question that's out there. How do we, 8 billion of us, work together?
Yeah. And civilization, international cooperation, person-to-person cooperation, firm-to-firm cooperation, these are all other things that I think matter and units of analysis that matter for thinking about that problem. But civilizations are probably the largest one, or geographies are probably the two largest units you can think of. And so trying to analyze civilizations becomes important. And again,
the code on which those civilizations
is organized, right? And so then the question of India as one node or hub of civilization, and China as another node and hub of civilization is an important part of that comparative civilizational thinking. So that, moving, you asked about what I taught about and what I think about when we think about states. Those are fairly large units. Alliance groups are another one, but then we go, the next level, highest level is civilizational forms of organization.
And then this is also kind of a good way for us to tie in as we talk about these. We've been talking about these as we said, a civilization as a node, let's say like India or China, and then we maybe talk about things at another level, like a geographic code that's written for people to live in, and then there's this company, and sometimes you see a Google, which has a YouTube, which has 2 billion eyeballs watching videos every single day, and what is the code that works on, or Tencent, what code does that work on, and Facebook, etc. These. And so now I would like to ask you about this. California has this Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and it's the 6th largest economy just in the world. Just the state of California is bigger than France, and this is some insane stuff of what's being pumped out of here in terms of entertainment and technology. And who's working together? Who are the ethicists and philosophers working with the engineers? And is that happening in authoritarian China as well, who's also commanding 1.5 billion eyeballs?
Well, you're bringing in the California piece, and since we're segueing from civilizations, it's important to remember that the technological part of California, Northern California, the Bay Area, and particularly the internet and digital globalization of this Bay Area, was driven, not exclusively, but significantly, by a diaspora that came from Taiwan, China, and from India, right? And so both
it's a melting pot.
The original coders and entrepreneurs, and then later large pools of capital, were organized by these diasporas. So China is Northern California and the Bay Area is a nexus of the Chinese and Indian and the North American. And what I find interesting is the globalization of California through those channels, and how the rest of the world is responding to what the platform monopolies, Google, Facebook, Amazon is, Seattle, but has activities here.
Definitely.
Netflix, of course, is here. And so the globalization of Northern California is, sort of underway. We're still trying to wrap our heads and minds around what that means, but it is certainly a juncture for all of these things, and trying to understand what the shape of Californian ideology, to lay it out there, there's a famous 1995 article called The Californian Ideology by Barbrook and Cameron that was written in 95 and has been controversial ever since, and is the question that drives a lot of people who are interested in California and what happens here, the mix of hippies, libertarians, technologists, and military-industrial complex. You got all four of these coming together.
Yeah.
Even before you get the Indian and Chinese diaspora coming in. So this is how to think about what's happening in California. And it is one of the few places where libertarians of the sort of Bitcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrency, and techno-utopians who believe that the space of the internet provides an analog to the Himalayas, a place to get away from states and organizations and orthodoxies and taxation and all those things, come together here in California. And so certainly that part of the Californian ideology is inescapable, or not inescapable, people can escape it, I'm saying is a distinct part of what would define the Californian ideology. How it's evolving is another question. I don't, given time and other things, I'm happy to discuss.
Give us a quick bit on your perspective on the evolution of this.
Yeah, well, so the Californian ideology is both changed and reinforced by the arrival of the platform monopolies, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, right? And for libertarians, there's an interesting problem, which is
why don't you loop in the Apple, LinkedIn, and Twitter in that?
Absolutely, that's true. Okay, Apple, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Apple doesn't have the monopolistic control, although it is the richest, one of the richest companies, although it oscillates. They are close, so we can certainly loop them in. But regulating them, what's happening now with the backlash against them and the idea that the state should come in, as the European Union has done with GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, GDPR, and California is now beginning to do, and other state governments around the US federal system are getting into, is a question that, challenges the Californian ideology, at least the libertarian part of it, from a complicated and difficult perspective. Monopolies are just as powerful as states. These companies are proving that, right? In some cases, they're more powerful than most states on the planet. So what to do about that? And that is, I think, is causing a reckoning for the way the Californian ideology had been going.
Censorship, algorithmic bias, these types of things are insanely important to talk about.
Right, and what should be done about them, right? If you're taking a pure market perspective, it's hard to say you can leave Facebook. Sure, you can leave Facebook, but there's no other social platform that you can go to. The network effects are very strong.
The network effects you can't run away from them.
Right, so this becomes very difficult.
Do you want to disseminate your ideas?
Right.
Yes. So then you have to play.
Right. Yes. So this is the monopolistic, or at least oligopolistic power of these players challenges the anti-statist element. Then you've got the cryptocurrency dimension that is also challenging this. On the one hand, cryptocurrencies are part of the techno-utopian element of the Californian ideology, a way for us to get away from states, from the Federal Reserve, from taxation, from these other elements that many anarchists, including the Zomayans, fled back in the day.
I love it. I love it.
And yet, even that is being captured. Cryptocurrencies, are we going to have a corporate cryptocurrency run by the consortium anchored by Goldman Sachs? Are we going to have one that's controlled by the group that's involved with the Winklevoss twins? Who is going to, we now have a competition for what was initially an anarchistic vector.
Right. That's right. A completely decentralized way for us to exchange value with each other. Yeah.
So this is, I observing this in Northern California and observing the way Northern California is connecting to the rest of the world and provides an example, right? Once again, if you are a politician sitting in India or in China or in any other country and somebody says to you, what do we need to do to develop economically? You say, we need to build a Silicon Valley. We need a cluster, right? So everybody wants to be like Northern California.
Piero Scroof, was just on the show, and everyone's asking him that question. How do you get to Silicon Valley in this area of the world?
Cluster development is important and maybe chimerical. It may not be possible. There's a sort of secret sauce, though there are certain key ingredients, institutions of higher learning, artists, creators. A port is generally a good thing.
Is a great thing, yes.
A variety of other things that tend to be useful. So can Silicon Valley be reproduced in certain ways, possibly?
We kind of see it in Hong Kong a little bit, we kind of see it, and this, a tiny bit we can say in like Tel Aviv as well. There's some interesting little...
well, in Bangalore,
Beijing,
the Pearl River Delta, in many of these places, I mean, Tel Aviv has a creative element, I understand, but the magic of Northern California, and we haven't even talked about the agro-business here, right? The Central Valley is connecting here.
It's crazy,
cannabis, wine, these are all other parts that contribute to the Northern California economy and that are parts of the way it all coalesces together.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought the ag piece in, because we're sometimes we get so in our Silicon Valley bubble, we forget about Hollywood and LA, and then we forget about Central Valley, which is where we get so much of our ag from, and then we forget about Napa and Sonoma, where wine, and then we forget about Humboldt with cannabis, and it's just funny that this is why California is so raging. And in many ways, you were talking about the diaspora of China and India that are also here doing work. There's the diaspora of just south of the United States in Mexico, Central America, South America that are here working really hard and producing a lot as well. And when we just had Diego Vigil on the show, an anthropologist, a social ecologist, he and other anthropologists say things like, it's become ridiculous when you say things like, no, you stay past south of the border, but if you want to come work in kitchens and work in the fields and stuff, we'd love to have you. This is bullshit. This has been built up so much. It's been such a harmonious synergy over the last, especially like 150 years of this western part of the United States being built up in this way. And I'm happy that we've touched on kind of like one of the core, I guess, pillars of what we've been talking about is how do we then go getting into this age of the digital globalized world? How do we update the code most effectively as we look at the Indian civilization, the Chinese civilization, the Silicon Valley, what is being built here in Bangalore, Hong Kong, etc. That Tel Aviv. How do we work together across these hubs to ensure a collaborative, ethical, moral, just framework for civilization?
Well, I turn to a mentor and person I really admire on this, Kavita Ramdas, who used to be at the Ford Foundation, now is at the Global Fund for Women. And her answer to this question, which she is often asked, is tend your own garden.
100%.
Focus on the
100%.
areas that you can control.
That's that sincere self-work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just your own work, but in your own neighborhood.
Neighborhood
And so,
too. Yes, yes.
you know, I would commend to people the way the Californian ideology is being changed in the ways you just mentioned. Next Tuesday, Logic Magazine becomes 2, and at City Lights Bookstore, a key part of California,
Totally.
Moira Weigel, who talks about labor, inclusion, women, all these things in the tech industry, and that magazine is devoted to talking about, are focusing on tending the garden here in Northern California and changing the Californian ideology to acknowledge the problems you're talking about.
Matthew, we got to feature, we got to have you back to keep unpacking this stuff. We also have to feature more people in your this network of leaders that you've been talking about I love it. Yeah, tending their own garden. Okay, just 2 quickies on the way out. This is simulation. Are we in a simulation?
When I was growing up, I often wondered if I was in a simulation. As a youth development thing, it regularly occurred to me, and I wondered whether I was part of a simulation. I don't believe so. I think we are agents and can change things ourselves. I mean, this is the question of the Kobayashi Maru from Wrath of Khan, Star Trek. You know, can you get out of the simulation and change it? But I don't believe so.
Okay, and then the last question. What do you think is the most beautiful thing in the world?
High alpine mountains.
Tell us more.
The undisturbed beauty and majesty of nature.
Yes, yes. And the connectedness that brings. Yeah. Matthew, it's been such a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Wonderful
to the show.
being here. Such an interesting time talking about all that stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. You're a wealth of knowledge, and we look forward to continuing talking about civilizations and geopolitics and all that goes into this. I'm really excited. Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We greatly appreciate it. We would love to hear from you and your thoughts in the comments below. Do let us know what you're thinking. Huge shout out to Ron Vargas for producing and directing. We love you very much. And join the community, guys. Get your thoughts, not only here in what we're talking about in our community chats, but go and talk to other people about this. Talk to other people about geopolitics, about political science, about what's going on in other parts of the world. Keep sharing those messages around. Support the artists and entrepreneurs that you believe in around the world in your community. Support them. If this content is useful to you, all our links are below to support us. Check out Matthew's links as well below. Go and check out his work more, support him as well. And go and build the future, everyone. Manifest your dreams into the world. We love you so much, and we will see you soon. Peace.